field had gone quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet you get at dusk when the crickets take over and the wind settles into the corn. This was the kind of quiet that only happens when a crowd of people has run out of things to say. 4 crane companies had sent their best rigs, 50 tons of equipment, hydraulic booms stretched wide, cables taut as bowstrings. They'd come from 3 different counties. The largest rig belonged to a company out of Des Moines that had lifted steel beams off collapsed bridges. These were not amateurs, and every single one of them had just told the same family the same thing. We can't get it out. There, in the low corner of a 70-acre soybean field, a 91,000-pound combine harvester sat buried past its axles in Iowa black soil. 3 days of hard September rain had turned solid ground into wet cement, gripping the machine from every direction. The crane operators had tried 6 approaches over 2 days. Every cable either snapped the rigging or threatened to tip the machine sideways. The combine wasn't just stuck. According to every professional in that field, it was lost. Then someone at the back of the crowd said, "Who's that?" At the field gate, a 12-year-old girl climbed up onto the seat of a weathered 1953 John Deere, green paint worn down to gray primer on the hood. A single rear wheel weighted with cast iron. She set the throttle, reached for the hand clutch, and fired it up. The engine sound was different from anything else in that field. Not the growl of hydraulics or the whine of a crane motor. A 2-cylinder rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Put, put, put. Her dark red hair was tucked under a seed corn cap. Her boots were 3 sizes too big. Her name was Willa Mae Granger. She drove through the gate, pulled up 20 yards from the nearest rig, cut the engine, and sat looking at the buried combine the way you'd look at a math problem you'd seen before. Nobody laughed, but nobody moved either. Could she actually know something they didn't? If stories about hard-working people and old-fashioned grit still mean something to you, subscribe and ride along with us. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know you're out there. The Granger farm sat on 340 acres outside Harlan, Iowa, land that had been in one family long enough that county maps just called it Granger ground without explanation. Willa Mae had been climbing on equipment since before she could reach the steering wheel. Her grandfather, Delbert Granger, Del to everyone, had started her on the old 1953 John Deere Model 50 when she was 7. He called it Granny Green, not with affection exactly, but because it had outlasted 2 floods and 1 lightning strike and deserved a name by now. Del was 81. He didn't walk the fields anymore. His knees had given out the same year his wife passed. He spent his mornings at the kitchen table with black coffee and a window facing east. But he still talked about soil the way some men talked about scripture, with authority and with reverence. What Willa Mae understood, that most 12-year-olds do not, was this. Old machinery was engineered around the land, not the other way around. The combine that was now buried belonged to her neighbor, Russ Heidecker, a 3rd-generation farmer who had taken out a second mortgage to buy it 2 years ago. It represented everything. The soybean crop still standing in the field was worth roughly $180,000. Without the combine, none of it would come out before the first hard frost. And without that harvest, Russ wasn't sure he'd make it to spring. That was why 4 crane companies had come. That was why a crowd had gathered. And that was why Willa Mae Granger, who had heard the news through her grandfather's police scanner, had started up Granny Green without asking anyone's permission. Here is what the crane operators understood. They had a weight problem. 91,000 pounds is roughly the weight of 8 adult bull elephants. On gravel, packed earth, or asphalt, you can extract a machine that heavy with the right rigging and the right angle of pull. But this wasn't any of those things. What none of the crane operators had trained for was the specific physics of saturated black Iowa soil after a long rain. And this is where farming knowledge and engineering knowledge diverge in ways that matter enormously. When soil absorbs that much water, it doesn't just get soft, it develops what agronomists call negative pore water pressure, essentially a suction force. The soil grips whatever is buried in it the way a vacuum grips a surface. The deeper the object, the stronger the grip. The combine's header had punched down nearly 26 inches into that low corner of the field, a spot that Russ's drainage tiles had never properly reached. The crane operators were pulling straight up or at slight angles, trying to overcome the weight. But they weren't accounting for the suction. Every cable was fighting not just 91,000 pounds of machine. It was fighting the ground itself holding on. One operator tried a sideways drag. That's when the rigging hardware failed. Lateral force on a machine suctioned into soft ground doesn't slide it, it tilts it. And a tilting 91,000-pound machine in wet soil digs one side deeper before it moves an inch. They weren't incompetent. They simply didn't grow up watching what happens to soil. Willa May had. The first thing Willa May did when she climbed down from Granny Green was walk the field edge on foot. Not toward the combine, away from it. She walked the perimeter of that low corner, pressing the heel of her boot into the ground every few steps, testing firmness, looking at where the water had pooled and where it had drained, looking at which direction the land sloped, even slightly. One of the crane operators, a broad-shouldered man named Keith Torrance, walked over. "You scouting an exit path?" he asked, not unkindly. "Looking for the hard floor," Willa May said. Keith didn't understand what she meant, but Willa May's grandfather had explained it on a wet spring morning when a disc harrow had sunk into a low corner, much like this one. He'd said, "The water always tells you where the clay shelf is, Willa. Ground stays soft above it and firms right at it. Find that layer and you've found your anchor." Clay subsoil doesn't absorb water the way topsoil does. It compacts. It holds. At roughly 14 to 18 inches below the surface of most Iowa black dirt fields, there was a layer of firm clay that hadn't moved in 10,000 years. If you could relieve the suction above that clay shelf, if you could give the soil a way to release the machine rather than grip it, the weight problem became manageable. Willa May had watched her grandfather do this with a disc harrow and a garden spade. She was about to try it with a 60-year-old tractor and a different kind of patience. She started by asking Russ Heidecker for something that surprised everyone watching. "Do you have a soil probe? Anything I can push down 18 or 20 inches? Russ found her a fence post driver and a length of half-inch steel rod. Willa May spent 45 minutes working the rod into the soil, around the combine's buried header at 8 different points. Not pulling, not yanking, just working it in slowly, rocking it side to side, then withdrawing it, creating channels. "She's aerating the ground," someone in the crowd said, half laughing. Nobody else laughed, because after the third rod insertion, the sound changed. A low, wet suck pulled from somewhere under the machine, air reaching the clay shelf. Keith Torrance had stepped closer. He wasn't leaving. Willa May then repositioned Granny Green at a precise angle, not straight back, not sideways, 40 degrees off the combine's center line, aimed toward the firmest ground she'd identified during her walk. She attached a single logging chain, not to the frame, but to the combine's rear axle housing, lower than any crane cable had been rigged. First pull. The combine didn't move, but the ground around the header settled slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Again," she said to herself. Second pull. Granny Green's rear wheels spun once, caught, and the chain snapped tight. A groan came from the buried machine. Third pull. The header lifted a half inch on the left side. The crowd shifted forward. On the seventh attempt, something gave way. Not dramatically, not with a crack or a roar. The soil simply let go. The suction released in a long, deep exhale that you could hear 20 feet away. A wet, hollow sound like a boot being pulled from deep mud, but enormous. Granny Green pulled forward at a slow walking pace, chain taut, engine singing its two-cylinder rhythm. The combine's header rose, then the front axle broke the surface, then the rear wheels, packed solid with black Iowa earth, rolled up and out of the hole they'd been in for 3 days. Russ Heidecker put both hands on top of his head and stood very still. Keith Torrance took off his hard hat and looked at it. Willa May cut Granny Green's engine and sat in the sudden silence. The combine was out, dirty, dented on one corner of the header, but structurally sound, drivable. The combine ran for 11 days straight. Russ Heidecker brought in his soybeans before the frost. 2 neighboring farms borrowed the machine once he was done. The harvest covered his mortgage payment and carried the farm into spring. But that isn't the part of this story Willa May thinks about. What she thinks about is what happened the evening after the recovery, when she drove Granny Green back home and found her grandfather sitting at the kitchen table where he always sat, coffee gone cold, eyes on the window facing east. She told him what had happened, every detail. The rod channels, the angle, the clay shelf. Del Granger listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You remembered. Not you were brave, not you saved the day, just you remembered, because that's what it was. Not magic, not genius, just a lesson passed carefully from one generation to the next, trusted to a child who paid attention. George Washington Carver once said, 'Where there is no vision, there is no hope.' In farming, vision doesn't mean staring at the horizon. It means seeing what's actually in front of you. The way water drains, the way soil breathes, the way ground beneath the ground holds secrets that machines alone cannot read." 4 crane companies looked at 91,000 pounds and saw an engineering problem. Willa May Granger looked at the same machine and saw a soil problem. That difference is the entire history of American agriculture. Knowledge carried in the hands and voices of people who learned to read the land before they could read a page. It has to be passed on deliberately from people who remember to people still young enough to believe it matters. Willa May believed it. And on a cold September morning in a flooded Iowa field, that belief moved 91,000 pounds. What's a piece of knowledge someone older passed down to you that turned out to be exactly right when it mattered most? Leave it in the comments. We read every one.